Hello guys and welcome to episode 10 where we talk about configurations. Now if we take a look at this config file, there are two problems here. First of all, we are hard coding and exposing the credentials of this connection string. So here you can get the user and the password for my database credentials, and then it's the same thing here for my secret that I use to create my tokens. That's the first issue. And the second issue is that here, for example, I'm connecting to my local host DB, which is not the case for a production environment, for example, or for a development environment. For development and production, we would typically use a separate database and a different one. Having this hard-coded in our code would mean that we need to change this over and over again. Instead, it's a good practice in Node.js applications to create a .env file in which we are going to store those variables in key value pairs. And of course, to make it secure, we should make sure that we do not push or commit this env file to Git or any other version control system that we're using. So to make sure of that, let's go to our git ignore file and then add .env. This way, we are not going to commit or push this file anywhere. And to be able to read that variable from the .env file, we could say process.env dot, and then here we specify the key name. So .connection string. This way we are no longer having anything hard-coded, so the sensitive data is secure and every environment is going to have a different value here. And we can do the same for the secret. On top of that, we should also use a package called .env, which if you take a look has a lot of weekly downloads. And what it does, it actually loads the environment variable from a .env file into process.env. And it's very simple to use. All you have to do is require it and then run the config method, and you would be able to access process.env and then access your environment variables, just like you can see here. Now that you understand that having a .env file to store your variables is the right and secure way to do it, you might be asking yourself that, alright, now I know how to have them locally on my machine, but whenever I deploy my application, how am I going to actually set those environment variables? Well, usually the platforms that you use to deploy your application on have secret vaults. So for example, if you take a look at the screenshot, this is from Railway. It's a platform that I use to host my backend on. As you can see, you have deployments and then you have variables in which you can actually set the environment variables. So all I have to do is just press new variable and then I set the key and the value. And to access those values, all I have to do is process.env and then the key name. So if I wanted to access app secret, I would just replace this with app secret. If you take a look at the NestJs documentation, that's what they say, that for different environments you would need to use different credentials for a database, for example. So it's better to have those variables in the environment itself to also keep them secure and not hard-coded in your code. And they also talk about the .env file use practice and so on. And then here they tell us that they have actually created a config module that you can use to make this easier for us. So all we have to do is actually install this nestjs/config package. And they also say that this package internally uses the .env package, which is the one that I just showed you right now. Let's go ahead and install that package using npm install. And then once it's installed, we need to import the config module to be able to use it. Typically you import it in your app module. So let's go ahead and say config module, and then let's make the import. Okay, so we import that from the package that we just got. And then here we have access to a static method called forRoot. And what this does is it loads process environment variables. Now, by default, it tries to find our .env file on our root level. So we don't really need to specify the path of that file. However, let's say we had a different name, for example, .env, .dev.env or anything else. We would need to specify the path of our file. To do that, we can access some options here for the forRoot method, such as env file path, for example, and then we give it our own path. But since we're using the default .env file path, it knows where to find it, so we don't really need to do that. So far, what we did is we imported the config module, and then after calling the forRoot method, behind the scenes, it loaded our environment variables from the .env file. So now we can access them using process.env. And what it also did is it created and registered a provider called ConfigService for us that we can use to load our configurations and our environment variables. And we can see that in the documentation, ConfigModule.forRoot. What this does is it loads and parses a .env file, and then the forRoot method registers the ConfigService Provider, which will provide us with a get method to access the configuration variables. And we can also see that we can use the environment file path to specify a different path if we had something else, and we can also pass in an array of env files. Let's take a look at some options that we can pass here. There's the cache option. If we set it to true, the values from the process.env object will be cached in memory, so this would improve the application performance. So let's go ahead and set cache to true. And then one more important thing is we can also use isGlobal, and if we set this to true, this config module is going to be available in our whole application without having to actually import it. If you remember in the episode where we talk about modules, to be able to access a module provider or a service, you would need to import that module wherever you need it. However, if we make it global, we can access it anywhere in our app without having to import the config module again. There's one more important option that we need to look at, which is load. And if we take a look here, we can see that it takes an array of custom configuration files to be loaded. So for example, here we have a configuration file that reads from our env. We can load that config file here in the app module, and then we would be able to read data from it using the config module via ConfigService Provider. Now, if we take a look at the documentation, they tell us that a custom configuration file exports a factory function, just like we see here, that returns a configuration object. So let's go ahead and make that change in our configuration so that we can use it with the package. We just simply have to do this. And now we need to load that file and give it to the array here. So if you take a look, it takes a custom configuration, config factory array. So let's go ahead and add that here. And this is the correct path for our config object. And now that we have this in place, let's see how we can use our config service to access those variables right here. And here they explain just that, saying the value assigned to the load property is an array, allowing you to load multiple configuration files. For example, database config, auth config. So in our application, you might have different configuration files. Each one of those files can have values relating to something specific, such as a database config file, auth config file, and so on. Or we could have just one config file that has nested objects in it. It doesn't matter. But the point is you can pass in an array and load and read data from multiple files. Now let's see how we can read those variables from the ConfigService Provider. So we can go to our product controller, let's say, and inside of our constructor, let's go ahead and say private config service. We're just injecting the config service just like we do with any provider. And of course, it should be from the NestJs/config. Now, this is available for us because, of course, we set ConfigModule.forRoot. So we use the forRoot static method to register this config service. And since it is global, since it's set to global true, then we are able to actually inject it right away without having to import the config module inside of our product module. Now let's go ahead and use this config service, and let's log, for example, a value. So let's say this.configService. And then here we have get and get or throw. Let's use get. And then here we can see that it gets a configuration value either from our custom configuration or from process environment variable. So we can either read something from our custom configuration files or from the .env file right away. So let's start with the .env key right away. So here let's say connection string, and then let's call this API to see what this actually logs for us. And now let's send a request to this route and take a look at our logs. As you can see, we actually printed the value for the connection string key, which is this, simply by doing configService.get, and then we specified the key that exists in our .env file. Now let's see how we can read from our custom configuration. Let's say we want to read connection string, which is nested inside of the database. What we could do is just simply specify the path, the nested path. So we could do database.connectionString. Let's see that. So here, let's, instead of giving it the key from our .env file, give it database.connectionString. Let's press save to restart our server. And now again, let's hit send. And as you can see, we actually got the same result. But this time, we are reading from our custom configuration. Now let's see what happens if we remove isGlobal true. Because if you remember, we said that setting global to true, this config module is going to be accessible anywhere in our application. Well, as expected, we got an error here, which says Nest can't resolve dependencies of the product controller, and then we see that the second argument is unknown. And it gives us more details about how we can solve this issue. Now, we've seen this error previously in a previous episode where we talked about providers, where we said that to be able to inject a provider as a dependency, we need to register it in our module, or we need to import a module that registers a certain provider and then exports it so that we can use it. Now, since this config module is not global, we would need to import it here to be able to have access to the ConfigService Provider. So let's go ahead and add this here, config module, and then we could say for feature, and we can pass a config factory. So we would need to pass in this object right here. So let's go ahead and do that. And now if we save again, as you can see, we no longer have any issue. The config service can now access this config file. And to prove that, if we hit on send, as you can see, we successfully were able to read the connection string. Also keep in mind that you should still have for root in your application, because now if you remove this, for example, from the app module, and then we still have it in our product module, so we are still importing the config module, but we're just using for feature. So now if we try to hit send, as you can see, we got undefined. And that's because we are missing an important part, which is loading the environment variables files. So not having for root actually means that we're not even loading the environment variables file in our process.env. So here we would get undefined. So always make sure to use for root first. Now I want to show you one more thing. First of all, let's go ahead and add the port as an environment variable, and let's set this to 3005. And then here in our config, let's go ahead and add the port. And of course, the key name in our .env file. Now, here in our main.ts, we no longer want to read this as a hard-coded field. Instead, we want to actually read it from our custom config file. So what can we do? In a previous video, we saw that we can actually say app.get and then get anything that we have registered in our app module here, such as the logger. And since we are already doing ConfigModule.forRoot, we know that we have registered a config service that we can use in our main.ts. So just like we did here, let's get our config, and then here we can say config service. And now we can go ahead and use that just like we've seen previously, config.get, and then here we can say port, which is the key here in our configuration file. Let's see if it's actually running on port 3005 now. Before changing it, I'm gonna hit on port 3000. As you can see, cannot connect to that. And then let's say 3005. If you hit on enter, we actually made a request. We got status code 200, and then we still got the log here. Now, if you go through the documentation, you're going to see that they explain what we just did, and they also go a bit deeper to explain how you can handle errors, missing configurations, and how you can also do schema validation, for example, to check if your env files respect a certain schema, and much more. To summarize, we said that it's not safe to have hard-coded credentials in our application. Instead, we should make a .env file in which we set our variables, and that we should not commit this to our version control, so we need to go to getignore and then specify this file. We also said that we can access those variables using process.env in Node. We can use a library such as .env to do that, or in the case of NestJs, we can use the config module. We can install that NestJs/config module, and then we're going to be able to import that module. We can use the for root static method to load those environment variables and to register them. And then it also creates a config service for us that we can use as a provider to access those variables either from our custom configuration files or from the .env file itself. We also saw many options that we can use, such as cache, load, in which we specify the configuration file that we want to read from, and then global, which if set to true is going to make this config module globally available in our application. So anytime we want to inject the ConfigService Provider as a dependency in our app, we no longer need to import this config module anywhere. And we also saw that if we want to have access to our configuration variables inside of our main.ts file, we can say app.get, and then we can specify that we're trying to get our ConfigService Provider. That way we can access our configuration variables. Thank you for watching. If this video was helpful, please leave a like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.